It doesn't matter how natural it is. The end result is the same. The earth is warmer because of our actions. This is part 2 of my response to What I've Learned's recent video on eating meat and climate change, essentially defending eating meat, saying it's not really that bad. If you haven't seen part 1, please check that out first.
Speaking of making use of our lands, livestock also contribute a very valuable resource for growing fruits and vegetables: natural fertilizer, manure.
Yeah, half of all fertilizers used in the world are animal manure. The other half are chemical fertilizers. And all fertilizers going onto organic crops are animal manure or other animal products.
Animals are not a unique source of nitrogen in protein, nor are they in manure. The nitrogen in manure came from what the animals ate. Literally, all we have to do is compost some of the food we would have fed to animals in order to recover that nitrogen. And with an increased reliance on legumes like soybeans, which fix their own nitrogen, closing the loop would be trivial. And the organic comment, not that I'm usually one to defend organic, animal products like manure and bone meal are the majority of fertilizer that's used in organic agriculture, but compost is used too. In fact, there's a whole trend called veganic agriculture. It's organic minus the animal blood and feces that organic farms spread over everything. Like I said, I'm not one to defend organic farming.
So while livestock takes some grain from humans, 50% of the fertilizer that makes crops like these grains possible come from livestock.
More manure on human crops just means more synthetic fertilizer on animal feed. Cows are not magic. Farmers are not doing us any favors by gifting us manure. It's hard for them to get rid of the shit. They want us to take it. Finally, we get to the world average doesn't matter clip that I shared earlier. Dr. Mitliner, he's responding to a Kurzgesagt, I meant to look that up, responding to one of their videos where they quote the 15% statistic.
To make our favorite food group even more unsustainable, about 15% of all greenhouse gas emissions caused by humans are created by the meat industry.
This number is misleading and mostly irrelevant. Why?
It is important to highlight that there are huge regional differences, and they have to be accounted for, because otherwise we are going on the wrong path to solutions, because the world average doesn't matter.
So yeah, he's actually criticizing Kurzgesagt for using global numbers when he and Will have been jumping back and forth between global and local when it suits them, when it suits the industry. But anyway, if we're talking about the US, then the numbers are a little lower, partially because of the higher efficiency of fattening animals on grains versus grasses, and partially because they're relative numbers, and the US is burning through just so much more fossil fuels for transportation and other industries. But you can't talk about cattle not consuming much grain and how they upcycle from marginal lands, and then talk about how you only want to mention US numbers for relative emissions, where those things aren't true, because obviously those numbers make you look better. I mean, you can, but it certainly calls into question your credibility as an expert on animal agriculture and climate change.
So when people in the United States say we should replace animal food with more plant food, think about the fact that crop agriculture accounts for more emissions than livestock. Where crop agriculture accounts for 4.7% of emissions, livestock only accounts for 3.9% of emissions. And everyone is talking about the environmental impact of beef, but cows are only 2% of emissions.
These numbers are wrong, as the source I referenced earlier explained. Those EPA numbers on livestock versus crop emissions are direct. They're not life cycle assessments. Crops include the grain given to livestock, which is the majority of grain grown in the US. So most of those emissions from crops are due to animal agriculture. This is the problem with dancing back and forth between US and global numbers and trying to find the numbers that look lower. Also, why is he using 2016 numbers? We have more recent data, as he clearly knows, given he links to 2019 data in the transcript. Direct livestock emissions, mostly methane, a little nitrous oxide, are 260.54 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, or 38.9%. Crops, including those fed to livestock, 55%, and fuel combustion, or agricultural machinery, 6.1%. Now again, animal agriculture is also responsible for over half of crop emissions, which is why honest life cycle assessments come up with around 80 or more % of dietary emissions coming from animal agriculture. 80+% emissions for less than half of dietary protein. Not a good value. Again, kind of a dumb way to eat. Now that beef industry funded study comes to even worse conclusions. A little bit of math and you get about 60%, and that's 60% for beef alone. That's 3 times what they claim it is. What can you say? You know, when it comes to Will, I don't know. I don't think he really understands a lot of this, but Dr. Mitliner, like he knows better, at least should know better. It's hard to see this as anything other than dishonesty. Like he's lying. He's lying to protect one of the most harmful, unethical industries in human history.
So if you were a citizen in the US eating beef, then you'd be in a country that produces 18% of the world's beef with 6% of the world's beef herd. So we have a very efficient beef production here, okay? And when I say very efficient, I don't mean CAFO. I mean, you can be efficient with a grazing system. You can be efficient with a more commercial system.
No, those numbers are a direct result of nutrient-dense grain feed, not grass. Again, you can't have both. You can't talk about the efficiency of CFAOs and then also talk about, use of marginal land. You can't call on factory farming when it suits you and grazing when it doesn't.
Particularly the beef and the dairy sector are extremely efficient here. While we, for example, have 9 million dairy cows in the United States, India has 300 million dairy animals. And they could produce the same amount of milk as they do currently with their 300 with 10 times fewer cows.
Yes, by tying them up so they can barely move and by feeding them grain instead of letting them graze on marginal lands. Pick your poison.
What about all the methane? Yes, methane does warm the earth much more than carbon dioxide, but the amount of methane is of course important. When we measure the methane in carbon dioxide equivalent, methane only accounts for 10% of greenhouse gases in the US. Of that 10%, 27% is enteric fermentation. That is methane from livestock burps. That's only 2.7% total, and that's from all livestock, not just cows.
That's a nice lie by omission, or, just not understanding any of this. That's possible too. Methane and nitrous oxide also come from manure management. It's almost half of the direct emissions from the animals themselves. And that still doesn't include the emissions from producing their feed.
Methane from cows and other animals comes from a natural cycle, and is much different from the carbon dioxide coming out of cars or airplanes, which came from fossil fuels.
No, it isn't. They both have atmospheric half-lives, and they both cause global warming. Methane is just more potent with a shorter half-life, and that is factored in to how it's calculated.
Grass takes up carbon from the air by photosynthesis. Then cow eat that plant and its carbon, and in the cow, the carbon is turned into methane, which is carbon and 4 hydrogens, CH4. Methane is then released into the air when the cow burps. Then in about 10 or 12 years, it's broken down into water and carbon dioxide.
You can't just dismiss methane because of its short half-life. It's far more potent than CO2, and again, that's how it's calculated. It's called CO2 equivalent, and methane gets a huge discount because of its shorter half-life, despite being some 100 times more potent than CO2. In most studies, they calculate based on a 100-year time window, but that's controversial because if we experience catastrophic climate change by 2050, who gives a fuck what happens in 2120? And if we haven't switched to fusion power in 50 years, we're in trouble anyway. More practical calculations use a 20-year time window, and in that, methane is almost 100 times worse than CO2, more than doubling the climate impact of enteric fermentation.
What this means is that the cow is not adding new carbon to the atmosphere. The methane it emits is made out of the carbon the grass got from the air in the first place. What this cycle means is that if you maintain the same amount of cows, they won't add additional warming to the earth. And over the past 20 years, the number of cows in the United States has mostly remained the same.
That's completely irrelevant because if we reduce the number of cows it will cool the earth. Whether we are warming the earth with our actions or maintaining the status quo and keeping it warm by not doing things that would cool it, the end result is the same. The earth is warmer than it would otherwise be because of our actions. Methane is one of the most important things to stop precisely because of its shorter half-life. It means we'll see faster returns and may actually be able to avert catastrophe.
On the other hand, when you rip fossil fuels out of the ground and burn them as fuel, you add totally new carbon in the form of carbon dioxide to the environment every time you drive your car or ride an airplane. And that's not a cycle, but a one-way street. It just builds up and stays in the atmosphere.
It doesn't matter how natural it is. The end result is the same. The earth is warmer because of our actions. It doesn't matter if you're just continuing to do the same bad thing that your grandparents did, or if you're doing a whole new bad thing. The status quo is no defense for inaction. And CO2 has a half-life too. It's absorbed by natural processes like dissolving in seawater through the oceanic carbon cycle and weathering rocks and forming carbonates. It's slower than oxidation of methane, meaning the half-life of extra atmospheric CO2 is more likely a couple hundred years. And in terms of the oceanic carbon cycle, it may reach a different equilibrium at a higher temperature, which makes things much more uncertain. It's not magic and it's not forever, but just like methane, it could give humanity some real trouble in the next few decades.
Ruminants adding methane to the environment is not anything new at all. A 2011 study estimated that hundreds of years ago, before the Europeans settled the United States, 50 million wild bison, as well as elk and deer, produce an amount of methane equal to 86% of that of present-day farmed animals' methane emissions.
Were these prehistoric animals also shitting in fecal lagoons that produce half as much methane and nitrous oxide CO2 equivalent as their burps? And were they eating grain grown for them by, I don't know, ancient aliens or some shit, releasing yet more greenhouse gases? No, it doesn't matter how many prehistoric mammals, dinosaurs were doing whatever, however many years ago. What matters is what is happening today and how our actions affect climate change. And again, there is no question that when it comes to dietary emissions, animal agriculture is the largest contributor by far.
The way they describe the impact of livestock on the environment, in my opinion, is dangerous. Why do I say it's dangerous? I say it's dangerous because we know that in places like the US or Japan or many other developed countries, by far the most impactful human activity on climate is the use of fossil fuel, oil, coal, and gas. That's the transportation sector, the power sector, it's the cement industry and so on. These three alone produce 80% of all greenhouse gas. Livestock, approximately 4 or 5%. That's not nothing, it's something, and it needs to be reduced. But to suggest that what you eat, whether you eat a burger this week or not, or sushi or whatever you eat, that would make a huge difference on our climate is irresponsible. Why? Because it is a smokescreen deflecting off the 800-pound gorilla. Some people call it the elephant in the room. And that is our use of fossil fuel.
So first, even in the US, livestock emissions are over 8%, not 4 to 5%. And again, in terms of dietary emissions, 80+%. Second, we do not have direct control over every emitting industry, military, public infrastructure. These are enormous, but there's not a whole lot we can do other than vote. When it comes to housing and other industries, again, our influence is limited by our privilege, really. If you're privileged enough to buy a car, buy an electric vehicle if you can. If you're privileged enough to own a home, do your best to improve energy efficiency. If you're privileged enough to have the know-how and the financial ability to build a new house or to renovate a fixer, avoid cement and steel as much as possible and look for green building materials. Otherwise, the biggest thing we can do is drastically reduce animal product consumption. What's dangerous, what's dishonest, what's a smokescreen is what Will and Dr. Mitliner are doing in this video. They're lying to us. They're sharing intentionally deceptive numbers, switching between US and global discussions based on which numbers they think will be more persuasive, and casting the blame on industries that individuals don't have much, if any, control over. It really sucks, and I hope more people can see through this bullshit. Pun not intended. It's not funny time. It's not like I'm talking to my kid. It's not funny time. Quit with the silly, it's time for bed.
When it comes to food, there's something much more worth talking about than meat. 1/3 of all the food produced in the world ends up wasted. The FAO says that if food wastage were a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitting country in the world. Food gets wasted for different reasons. In developed countries, waste mostly happens at the retailer and consumer end. In the United States, 40% of all food does not get eaten.
Food waste is bad, but is it really so bad that it's more worthy of discussion than meat consumption? No, not even close. Municipal solid waste landfills only make up 15% of US methane emissions compared to 36% from animal agriculture. That's enteric plus manure. Less than half. So no, it is not more important than animal product consumption. It's also an issue that's easily solved by regulation and modern technology. Modern landfills capture landfill gas and burn it for energy. This is not something that can be done in CAFOs. Now here in Portland, we do have a municipal compost program. So all of our food scraps, they don't go into the garbage, they go into our green compost bins. They start in this little tiny one that we have in the kitchen. Anyway, it's honestly one of the best things about Portland. Every single city should have a green bin for you to put your food scraps and whatnot in so that they don't end up in a landfill producing methane. But if you don't have one and you have a house and a place for composting, certainly composting on your own is a great idea. Point is, all of this matters. All of this is something that vegans are concerned with. Vegans talk about composting and avoiding food waste all of the time, but to say that it is more important than animal product consumption is ludicrous.
Another thing in that study that calculated the emission reduction of everyone going plant-based didn't take into account was food waste. This is important because what is getting wasted? Meat and dairy makes up 14% of our food waste. But the non-animal foods make up the majority of our food waste. Fruits and vegetables make up 42%, cereal grains including bread and rice make up 22%, and roots and tubers like potatoes make up 18% of our food waste, meaning non-animal foods make up 82% of our food waste. So while animal agriculture isn't perfect, another side effect of giving it up would probably be more food waste.
The study he's referencing again is the dumb, if all Americans went vegan, we'd get fat and malnourished off corn. So that's funny. But also, he admits here that these are global numbers. So once again, jumping from local to global, just in the span of seconds, seemingly knowing that no one's going to read this beyond a service level, except for me, I guess. Lucky me. Anyway, in the US, animal products make up 28.2% of food waste, and actually it's worse than that because other foods here represents another 14.8%, and that includes eggs, fish, and shellfish. So he's using drastically wrong numbers again, jumping to global numbers again because it looks better because drastically fewer animals are consumed, and then comparing it to this nonsense. But that's not the worst part. So is all of this by weight or by calories? Well, it's by weight. Methane is produced by decomposition of calories, of food energy, not by like how many kilograms there are. Now, animal products have around twice the caloric density of the fruits and vegetables and breads that are dominating plant food waste. So when you account for caloric density, animal foods are probably disproportionately contributing to methane production in landfills compared to their role in our diets. Animal products also contain more nitrogen and other limiting minerals, which may fuel microbial replication and increase methane production across the board. This is something we can only speculate on because, as the report says, EPA has not yet analyzed differences in greenhouse gas emissions by food waste type in the composting, combustion, landfilling, and anaerobic digestion pathways. We're basically still waiting on that data, which is a damn good reason for a study like that to leave it out rather than make assumptions like somebody we know. Point is, there is no reason to believe that switching to plant foods would increase food waste. If anything, we would expect a reduction. Less animal products means less risk for contamination and longer safe shelf lives of food. I mean, E. coli lettuce is a lot less common when you're not spreading shit all over your vegetables.
Now, whether it's meat or vegetables, all food waste in general is a huge problem first and foremost. All the resources that went into making all these foods get wasted along with the food. And animals could be a part of that solution because the old bakery goods or bruised fruit and vegetables that won't sell or nobody wants to eat could be fed to livestock.
Or they could be composted. And it's really funny to think that we could actually divert any significant amount of like food waste, like spoiled food, to animals. First, not all spoiled food is safe for animals. We're not talking about like imperfect produce. We're talking about moldy and rotten food. Pigs can handle a little bit of that, but aflatoxin content in their feed is a serious concern. It would be against so many food safety regulations to feed these animals from these waste streams. Second, no municipal recycling or compost stream is cleaned or properly sorted. Our compost, for instance, has little bits of plastic in it, which is fine for just a garden. It's fine. It's not hurting anything. But do we really think it's fine for animals to be filling up on plastic bags full of rotten food? And what about like broken glass or non-ferromagnetic metals? The technology to clean and sort these things economically does not exist. Finally, even if all of those problems could be solved, it doesn't make sense economically to create another waste stream. Again, we're lucky to have municipal compost, which handles both food and yard waste, but another stream on top of that, which would be 4 total: regular garbage, recycling, compost, and waste for animals. This would only add cost and complexity to an already costly and complex collection system, not to mention more greenhouse gases being emitted. These trucks, like cows, don't run on magic. So that's the video, and the really dumb thing about it, so the clickbaity title, "Eating Less Meat Won't Save the Planet, Here's Why," it's not actually clickbait. We can't save the planet by eating less meat. We can't even do it by going fully vegan. You could make a really interesting, informative, accurate video talking about how important it is to reduce animal product consumption, but that it still isn't enough. You could talk about cars, you could talk about cement in the building industry, you could talk about renewables and nuclear energy, you could talk about innovation and how desperately we need it, all while keeping that same dumb clickbaity title that gets all the views. Instead, Will chose to come across like a shill for the beef industry. It's pretty embarrassing. Finally, animals are sentient beings. You know, that kind of gets lost here with all the numbers and the beef animals, as Lerner calls them, which makes sense. You know, if you're trying to advocate for the efficiency of factory farming, you probably don't want to sully that message with the truth about the suffering these animals endure. But that's the truth. They endure a lot of suffering for your efficient system that actually isn't efficient at all. It's kind of a really dumb way to eat. Just saying. I hope you did enjoy it. I hope you learned something. I know there's a lot, and you know, it's easy to get bogged down in stuff. I get it. Hopefully making it 2 parts helped out a little bit. I don't know. Again, it just takes so much more time and effort to debunk false claims than just making false claims in the first place. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Like the video if you liked it. Subscribe if you liked it and would like to see more stuff like this. You can also support the channel. I do have a couple exclusive videos on Patreon every month for everyone on the $5 tier and up. Thanks again. New video very soon. They start in this little tiny one that we have in the kitchen that partner has to take out. That's right, partner. I do not touch this. I have never once, not once, have I opened this thing and tied up the bag and put it into the compost bin. Nope, not my job. Nasty stuff, not my job. Wiping a baby butt with poop, it's like not even gross. Touching old banana, not even touching them because they're in the bag, but just like the possibility of touching yucky old coffee grounds and banana peels. But baby poop, who gives a shit? It's just poop.